In this section, we're going to look at plants and crops in terms of agriculture. One of the biggest changes over the last 100 years in food production has been industrial food production. Industrial food production, also called high-input agriculture, relies heavily on fossil fuels and heavy equipment, that being tractors and heavy equipment, trucks that move food from place to place, big, large, expensive tractors costing in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to till the land, harvest the grain, that sort of thing. It requires a large investment of finances. You can imagine, I said three to $500,000 for a large tractor. Water, particularly in areas where water is not abundant, use of fertilizers and pesticides, and typically these are all to grow what's known as a monoculture. So they're growing one crop essentially. They're growing corn, they're growing wheat, they're growing soybeans. One of those three, and it's all the same, all uniform. 25% of all of the cropland across the globe is considered industrial. The goal was always to increase the yield, and I think we saw in the food video that production has gone from in the 1950s to from as low as like 9 bushels per acre for corn to over 120 bushels per acre for corn. This is primarily in developed countries. It is spreading to some developing countries, and it does produce the largest share of the food in the world. Another similar idea is plantation agriculture. Here it's an industrial agriculture, but it's usually considered more in developing countries and not in a developed country. These are those places that would produce bananas, coffee, cocoa, sugarcane, and grow those primarily for export to the developed world. Again, if you remember from the previous videos, bananas, almost every country, whether they were European, Asian, North America, had bananas on their tables for food. These are considered cash crops. They're grown to be sold to a very large market, and you can definitely see that's true by the amount of coffee and bananas and chocolate that we have worldwide. Another type of industrial food production are large greenhouses. The benefit of greenhouses is that they grow crops year-round. They usually do need heated by some amount to either solar or geothermal. They're pretty efficient when it comes to water use, but it is expensive to grow. And typically they also rely primarily on monocultures, where one entire greenhouse will all be filled with tomatoes, or tens of greenhouses will be filled with tomatoes. The one problem here is that it does pretty much neglect the nutrient cycling. The heavy use of fertilizers in this type of environment, and I said it can be grown year-round. I remember last fall in December, maybe even, I was buying some tomatoes and I looked to see where they were produced, and they were from Canada. I'm thinking, how's that I'm getting tomatoes from Canada in December? But that's basically the extent of a greenhouse. Another growing trend is hydroponics. This uses a nutrient-rich water solution instead of soil, and it's also usually done within a greenhouse. Benefit, it can be done anywhere as long as they have access to water, and it does recycle the nutrients in the water. The nutrient-rich water just cycles through. It really doesn't go anywhere. The plants are actually grown in a water solution. There's less need for pesticides usually as a result. A large initial investment, but cheaper overall. If you've ever been to a couple of the local market districts, actually have some displays where they're actually growing lettuce and a couple other herbs maybe in hydroponic situations. As opposed to the industrial agriculture, the alternative is traditional agriculture. 39% of the people around the globe use traditional agriculture, and primarily it's considered subsistence agriculture. That means they're just growing enough crops for their family to survive. Usually this is very labor intensive. It's human effort, draft animals, things like that. And examples of this would be nomadic herding and a shifting cultivation. We'll talk about that in a bit. And these are, again, subsistence farming. These are used by the grower to feed their families. They might be growing some grains that they then store for later use, or they might have some amount extra that they would sell locally just to have money or trade or barter for other services or food. A slight variation on the traditional agriculture is traditional intensive agriculture. Here you have an increased input of human effort, animals to plow the fields, etc., fertilizer, water, and this kind of just gives them, it's kind of like a step up from subsistence farming where you do have a surplus typically to sell, and that you're going to have some cash crops, and usually you're going to have some variety here, and it won't be complete monoculture, but quite a few crops grown on the same plot of land. In the tropics, we often come across what's known as a slash and burn agriculture. Here, very dense forest area, and to have any area at all to grow crops, you need to get that sunlight in there, so you have to clear the forest. And so essentially it's burned and clearing a small plot. Unfortunately, that soil is usually very nutrient poor because there's very little decomposition that goes on. The soil is low in nutrients. Most of the crops that we grow are usually high need for nitrogen, and within a couple short years, the supply of nitrogen will decrease dramatically, and it won't be a really good soil any longer. So the result is move on to another plot. So that's one way that there's also deforestation in the tropical forests, is just by subsistence farming, essentially. If we look at a map of the patterns of food production, you can see the areas in orange are the ones that primarily have industrial agriculture. And you can see that's pretty much all of North America and most of Europe, Australia, and some in South America. The dark blue are areas of plantation agriculture, and you can see those would be the places that are primarily those ones where we get bananas and coffee and cocoa and that sort of products from. Across northern Africa and parts of Asia, nomadic herding, and then in the light green, intensive traditional agriculture, and you see that primarily in India and China. Notice there's very few places at all where there's no agriculture. Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and northern parts of Russia, where it's completely covered with boreal forests and very too cold of conditions really to have an extended growing season. Starting in about the 1950s and 60s, what came about was something known as the Green Revolution. There were 3 steps in the Green Revolution. This was really to promote improved agricultural practices. What happened during that time is government and industry both worked together and developed and planted monocultures, where you would have just field after field of rice, or field after field of corn, or field after field of wheat, as opposed to smaller traditional farms where they would usually plant a variety of crops. This was just, I'm a corn farmer and that's all I do is I grow corn. This would produce a very high yield, and they would do so by use of pesticides, fertilizers, and watering the crops as well. So this would take an excess amount of that, so water applications were done, and etc. This would definitely increase the number of crops per year. Maybe they would grow one crop and harvest it, and then grow a second round of that same crop through the year if that was possible. Through this Green Revolution from the 50s through the 1970s, that was considered the Green Revolution in the developed countries, we did see this dramatic increase in crop production. Just the yield per acre of how many bushels of corn or wheat were produced just went up phenomenally. Since that time, we've had what we've called the second Green Revolution. And here we're seeing that new varieties of different types of plants have been introduced, more in the tropical regions, and seeing much better yields. And this is due to some genetically engineered strains of rice and wheat. And the overall goal here was really to produce more food on less land. When we look at grain production, and by grains we would mean crops like corn and wheat and rice, 48% of the grains are consumed directly by people. A lot of that grain, though, is provided for food for livestock, and some is used to make biofuels. In the U.S., we have 25% of our corn is actually used to produce biofuels. When we look at the world distribution of crops, we can see that, what do we produce? Wheat, corn, and rice are the main crops that we have. And in North America, it's primarily wheat, which are the red triangles. But you can see that's also across Canada and a lot of Europe and a couple places in South America. Corn, a lot in the tropics, a lot in Africa, a few places in Asia. And rice primarily, you can see some locations, just a few locations in the US, but primarily in India and China. So what's the effect of our food production? We need to keep in mind, though, some of the positives as well when it comes to food production. And one of those positives are that we're feeding lots and lots of people. We have 7 billion people on this planet now, and for the majority, people have food, and may not be in the best quantity, or always necessarily the best quality, but a lot of people do have access to food. But what are some of the consequences of our industrial food production? One is we're losing biodiversity, and that's from degradation from clearing forests, etc., loss of genetic diversity by replacing polycultures with monocultures. Another effect is soil erosion, loss of soil fertility, desertification, the slash and burn techniques from the forest. Another effect that often unthought of, you think of farming, you think of blue skies and green fields, but air pollution can be a serious issue. A lot of times those tractors run on diesel fuel, which is has a high amount of particulate matter, and then so there's air pollution, other pollutants from fossil fuel use, pollution from pesticide sprays, fertilizers, etc. With water, we have to think about aquifer depletion for sure. That Ogallala aquifer we've talked about, that's providing the crux of the water for the Midwest. Sediment pollution from erosion, fish kills from pesticide runoff, surface and groundwater pollution from pesticides and fertilizers, getting that eutrophication in bodies of water, and over-fertilization, just increasing the nitrates and phosphates and processing the waste. For consequences of human health, nitrates in drinking water from the fertilizers can be an issue, contamination of drinking water, and bacterial contamination of meat. That ends the discussion on plants. We'll go on to the next one with livestock.